Spencer Stuart is our books expert here on North by Northwest. Today he's talking about Shakespeare and Company, the iconic, and I think it's safe to call it that, English bookshop in Paris. It opened early in the 1900s with Sylvia Beach, the owner, and it became a place where you could not only find the latest books, but meet authors too. Ernest Hemingway was a frequent visitor, along with others from the so-called lost generation in Paris. And Sylvia Beach was instrumental in getting some real milestones of 20th century literature published. For example, against tall odds, James Joyce's Ulysses. Sylvia Beach opened the doors of Shakespeare and Company in November 1919, so this month is a bit of an anniversary. She was an American, traveled many times to Paris as a young woman, and as Spencer Stuart picks up the story, she first had an idea to open a book business in the USA.
And she sort of talks about starting funnily enough, a French literature bookstore in New York. So that was her initial thought. But she had only a savings of about $3,000 US, which at the time really wouldn't have gotten you anything in New York. Similar to now, I mean, if you were to update the buying power, you still wouldn't be able to do much. But she noticed that in Paris it was very viable. And so, interestingly enough, she chooses actually to do a focus on English literature
in Paris.
In Paris, and at that point in time, you have a huge group of expats. Of course, Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, what was later coined by Gertrude Stein as the Lost Generation, and then in Hemingway's books connected with that name as well. Very rare public readings given by Hemingway were done in Shakespeare and Company.
What was it like?
The photographs of it that you can see, and many of them are connected to the popularity of one of the books that we've featured on the show of James Joyce's Ulysses. It's an image of, you could imagine walking in and Sylvia Beach is there telling James Joyce either I'm going to get money or I don't have money yet for you, and he's got a pirate patch on, and every once in a while, Stephen Spender may walk in or something like that. It was really like that, and people would sort of make a pilgrimage to go see this store. Funnily enough, though, in the 1930s with the Great Depression, it wasn't actually easy to keep Shakespeare and Company going, and this is where you really see that it was a community center. André Gide set up a Friends of Shakespeare Company club, which had an annual subscription of 200 francs. And also you see Annie Ellerman, who was the daughter of John Ellerman, the shipping magnate. He was basically believed to be the sort of wealthiest man in England at the time. She sort of kept it financially afloat. And then, of course, the invasion of the Nazis in 1941 forced her to close the doors of the store. Oh. And there's a famous story around this that's quite fascinating, that at that point in time, the Nazi authorities were moving through the city and sort of intimidating people. And one high-ranking officer apparently came in and asked to purchase what was the final copy of Finnegan's Wake that was in the display window. And she denied him sale of the book.
Oh, a bold move.
At which point he apparently stormed out, and that's when she knew that obviously they were going to be, coming for her. And she banded together with a bunch of her friends, and they moved the entire contents of the library up to her apartment, which was 2 floors up. Next day, you have a bunch of these troopers moving in, trying to, ruin everything, and there's nothing to be had. And she ultimately stayed in Paris throughout the entire war. For a period of time, she was interned in a prisoner camp in Vittel for about 6 months, at which point William Tudor Wilkinson, he basically freed her from the prison. And she went back to Paris and stayed there and held tough during those difficult times.
Did she reopen the bookstore then?
She did not. It was actually liberated by Hemingway and his group. So there's a famous story that one day she's sort of up in the second floor and she hears a Jeep rolling around the corner and a honking horn, and there's heroic Hemingway with a bunch of guys. And she comes down, opens up the door, and he comes up to her, and he first of all says that he's here to liberate Shakespeare and Company, which had been so helpful for him in his career. And he asks her, "Is there anything that I can do for you?" She says, "Yeah, well, you can deal with the snipers that are on the roof." And so the story goes. He goes up there with his whole group of guys. You hear a firefight on the roof, and they come down again. And so it was never a dull moment in the life of Sylvia Beach. She was someone who really was a total magnet, and someone who I think really trusted these people.
And she was so important. Like with Ulysses, she was really instrumental in getting that James Joyce's book published.
Absolutely,
right?
And she's a pioneer of censorship laws as well. I mean, she was the first person to have Lady Chatterley's Lover in a bookstore when it was banned, when it was first published. So you knew you could go to Paris and you could pick it up at her store. What happened after the war is that she wrote a memoir in 1956 called Shakespeare and Company, which really that's how we know about the richness of the day-to-day experience of being in her store. And that's sort of where it ends for her involvement with Shakespeare and Company. But enter stage left George Whitman, who's the sort of second part of Shakespeare and Company. And he's an interesting character. He's almost exactly a generation younger than Sylvia Beach. He was born in the 1910s. He's 26 years younger. He grew up in the New Jersey area. However, there was a little stint when he was a kid where his family was over in China. So he had a little taste of travel, similar to Sylvia Beach. And during the war, he was stationed in Greenland in a weather post. And afterwards, of course, with the GI Bill, it gave him a little bit of financial freedom to travel around. And the first thing he did is he made his way over to Paris. He comes in 1946. He starts up his own bookstore in 1951 called the Mistral, right across the way from Notre Dame.
Ah, yes, right.
And what happens is he runs his store for a period of time, and then at a party in the 1950s, he already knew Beach by that point, but they were talking, and she made a public announcement that she was going to hand over the namesake of Shakespeare and Company to George Whitman and Le Mistral. And so she passes away in 1962, and in 1964 he changes the name of his bookstore to Shakespeare and Company,
so that's
where
the
it
one
is now today.
That's there now. Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And I mean, and becomes a support community and a refuge for travelers in its own way. He famously allowed people to stay the night there, which was, I'm not sure if that was something that was allowed with Beach's setup, but he sort of imagined it as a utopia disguised as a bookstore, as he said.
I love it.
Yeah, and he would, he counted at 30,000 people had slept in Shakespeare and Company books. And what they would do is, in exchange for sleeping there, they would work the day as a cashier or sweep up. And he'd make
wonderful.
these famous crepes that were very simple, and everything was very straightforward with him. That was really a meeting place for the next generation, the Beat generation of Burroughs, Kerouac, Ginsberg, and other characters, Anais Nin, James Baldwin. I've counted 6 different literary journals that had Shakespeare and Company as their mailing address, including the Marlin, which was a famous publication that translated Samuel Beckett's plays into English and kind of catapulted him into an international scene in the 50s.
It's been so pivotal.
It has been, and it's physically a place that you go to right away. It's gravitational. What's interesting to note is that George Whitman passed away in 2011, but in 2003, his daughter started to get involved in the store, and her name, interestingly enough, was Sylvia Beach Whitman. So carried on the tradition very much, and she has, really, I think, secured the survival of that bookstore for another century, we could say. She has all of this programming. If you go on their website, there's things going on constantly. If you go to Paris and you go to the Shakespeare and Company, you'll see something happen. It really is an example for what bookstores really are. When they're really good, they can become community centers and hubs, and they can indeed inspire new writing. not only do they sell great books, but they can also, have writers from the community there as well. So to 100 more years, hopefully somehow someone will be talking about it on the radio then as well. So.
Thank you, Spencer.
Well, thank you for having me.
Spencer Stuart, and he is our books expert, our books columnist here on North by Northwest. It's just about